Princess Lyra of the Starborn Elves never imagined that a routine scouting mission would change the course of her entire life, and as her sleek silver spacecraft glided through the outer reaches of an unexplored solar system, she felt the familiar excitement that came with discovering new worlds, and her two dragons rested in the cargo bay, and Ember curled into a tight ball of golden scales, while Shadow stretched his massive midnight blue form across the floor. And they had been with her since they hatched from their eggs 15 cycles ago, and they were more than pets, and they were her family and her protectors and her closest friends. The scanners detected the third planet from the system's star, and it showed signs of primitive civilization and radio waves and nuclear energy and combustion engines, and Lyra smiled because these were always the most interesting worlds to observe and species on the edge of space exploration, but not quite there yet, and she adjusted her course to enter orbit, and her fingers dancing across the holographic controls, and the ship responded smoothly. And she had flown this vessel for years, and knew every system and every quirk. Everything went wrong in an instant, and the ship's alarms blared with deafening intensity, and red warning lights flooded the cockpit, and Lyra's hands moved frantically across the controls as she tried to understand what was happening. And the main engine was failing, and the stabilizers were offline, and the hull temperature was rising rapidly, and something had struck her ship, and maybe a micrometeorite or maybe space debris, and whatever it was, had torn through the shields like they were made of paper. Ember and Shadow roared from the cargo bay, and their distress echoing through the ship, and Lyra fought to maintain control as the spacecraft began its uncontrolled descent toward the planet's surface. And the atmospheric entry was brutal, and flames engulfed the hull, and the ship shook violently, and Lyra's restraints dug into her shoulders, and she could see the planet's surface rushing up to meet her, in deserts and mountains and oceans, and she aimed for the emptiest area she could find, and a vast stretch of sand and rock that seemed uninhabited. The crash was devastating, and the ship plowed through the desert, sand and metal, screaming and tearing, and finally coming to rest half buried in a dune. And Lyra hung upside down in her restraints for a moment, and her pointed ears ringing, and her luminous skin covered in cuts and bruises, and she released the buckles and dropped to what was now the ceiling, and pain shot through her ankle, but she ignored it, and she had to check on her dragons. The cargo bay door had been torn open during the crash, and Ember and Shadow were already outside and circling the wreckage, and their keen eyes scanning for threats, and when they saw Lyra emerge, they rushed to her side, and Ember nuzzled her hand gently, while Shadow positioned himself between her and the open desert and ready to defend against any danger. The ship was destroyed beyond repair, and Lyra assessed the damage with a sinking heart, and the engine was shattered, and the communication array was gone, and the faster-than-light drive was nothing but twisted metal, and she was stranded on this primitive planet with no way to contact her people, and no way to go home, and the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, and she had no idea where the nearest settlement might be. Night fell quickly, and the temperature dropped, and Lyra huddled between her two dragons and their body heat, keeping her warm, and she stared up at the unfamiliar stars and wondered if anyone would come looking for her in the Starborn Empire had many scout ships and many planets to survey, and it might be cycles before anyone realized she was missing. The next morning brought scorching heat and blazing sun, and Lyra knew she needed to find water and shelter and civilization, and she could survive for a while with the emergency supplies from the ship, but not indefinitely. And Ember took flight, and her golden scales glinting in the sunlight as she scouted ahead, and Shadow stayed close to Lyra, and his massive form providing shade as they walked across the burning sand. They traveled for hours, and the wreckage of the ship disappearing behind them, and Lyra's injured ankle throbbed with every step, and sweat soaked through her flight suit, and she was beginning to wonder if she would die in this desert when Ember returned, and chittering excitedly, and the small dragon circled overhead and flew off in a specific direction, and clearly wanting them to follow. What Lyra found beyond the next dune gave her hope, and a ribbon of black material stretched across the desert, and perfectly flat and perfectly straight, and she had seen similar constructions on other primitive worlds, and a road, and which meant civilization was near. And she followed it, and limping badly, now in Shadow pressed against her side and offering support. The structure appeared in the shimmering heat like a mirage, but it was real, and a small building made of metal and concrete, and strange symbols painted on the walls and vehicles, parked outside, and Lyra recognized them as primitive transportation and combustion engines and rubber wheels, and she had studied many pre-spaceflight civilizations. And as she approached, a figure emerged from the building, and a male of the native species, and tall and brown-skinned and wearing stained coveralls. He froze when he saw her, and his eyes going wide and taking in her pointed ears and her luminous skin, and her torn flight suit and the two dragons flanking her, and for a moment, neither of them moved, and then he spoke in a language she did not understand, and harsh consonants and rolling vowels. Lyra's translator had been damaged in the crash, but it still worked partially, and she caught fragments of his words, and "Are you okay, and what happened, and do you need help?" And his tone was concerned and not hostile, and that was promising, and she tried to respond, but her voice came out as a croak, and her throat was parched, and she had not had water since the crash. The human, and she assumed that was what this species was called, and rushed back into his building and returned with a container of liquid and water, and he offered it to her carefully and as if afraid she might bolt, and Lyra took it gratefully, and drank deeply, and Shadow and Ember watched the human suspiciously and ready to strike if he made any threatening moves. "Thank you," and Lyra said in her own language, and knowing he would not understand, but hoping her tone would convey gratitude, the human smiled, and it transformed his face and made him look younger and kinder, and he gestured to the building and clearly inviting her inside. And Lyra hesitated, and she had been trained to avoid contact with primitive species and to observe, but never interfere, but she was injured and stranded and desperate, and she nodded and followed him, and her dragons trailing behind. The interior was cooler and filled with tools and machinery and strange equipment, and the human cleared a space on a worn bench and helped her sit, and he examined her injured ankle with gentle hands and talking the whole time in his incomprehensible language, and Lyra's translator caught more words now, and mechanic, and fix, and help, and lucky, and found you. He introduced himself and pointing to his chest, and Danny, and he said, and Danny Rodriguez. Lyra repeated the gesture, and Lyra, and she said, and her name sounding musical compared to his. Danny grinned and set to work, and he brought medical supplies, and primitive but effective, and he cleaned her cuts and bandaged her ankle and brought her food and some kind of bread and preserved meat and fruit, and she ate gratefully, and her strength returning, and Ember and Shadow relaxed slightly, and the small golden dragon even accepting a piece of meat from Danny's hand over the next few hours, and Danny tried to communicate, and using gestures and drawings and his translator device that he called a phone, and Lyra's own translator began adapting to his language and learning the patterns, and soon they could have basic conversations, and Danny asked where she came from, and she pointed to the sky, and his eyes widened, and he asked about her ship, and she described the crash, and he immediately wanted to see it and to help repair it. They returned to the crash site in Danny's vehicle in a loud and bumpy and uncomfortable machine that belched smoke and rattled constantly, and Danny circled the wreckage and muttering to himself and occasionally stopping to examine something closely, and Lyra watched him and this primitive human and realized he understood more than she expected, and he pointed to components and asked questions and good questions and questions that showed genuine intelligence and curiosity. "Can you fix it?" and Lyra asked, and her translator finally working well enough for complex sentences. Danny looked at the destroyed ship and at the shattered engine and at the twisted metal, and he shook his head, "And not with what I have here," and he said, but maybe we can build something, and it will take time." Time was something Lyra had, and she was stranded on this planet indefinitely, and she nodded, and "Okay," and she said, "And I will help." Danny smiled again, and that warm, genuine smile, "And we will figure it out together," and he said, and Lyra felt the first stirring of hope since the crash, and this human mechanic in the middle of nowhere might be her only chance to return home, and she did not know it yet. But this decision to trust him and to work with him and to share her knowledge with him, and would set in motion events that would shake two civilizations to their cores, and would make her regret everything. But that was still to come, and for now, and she simply followed Danny back to his workshop and her dragons at her side and ready to begin the long journey home. The weeks that followed the crash became the strangest time of Lyra's long life, and Danny's workshop transformed into something between a laboratory and a home, and the small building filled with alien technology and human tools and two dragons, who had learned to tolerate the heat, and Danny proved to be far more intelligent than Lyra had initially assumed, and he absorbed information about elven technology with frightening speed, and his questions grew more sophisticated each day, and he understood concepts that should have been beyond a primitive species in quantum mechanics and dimensional folding and energy manipulation. Ember had taken a particular liking to Danny, and the golden dragon often perched on his workbench while he labored over circuit boards and strange components, and she would tilt her head and watch his hands move and occasionally chirp when he did something she found interesting. And Shadow remained more aloof, and the massive blue dragon positioned himself near the door and always watching and always ready to protect Lyra if this human proved to be a threat. Lyra found herself talking to Danny about more than just technology, and they shared meals together and strange human food that was often too salty or too sweet but always interesting. And he told her about his life and growing up in this desert town and learning mechanics from his father and dreaming of the stars. And she told him about the Starborn Empire and about the thousands of worlds they had explored and about the ancient civilization that had built wonders humans could not imagine. "You must think we are very primitive," and Danny said one evening as they sat outside and watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of orange and red, and Ember and Shadow sprawled nearby and their scales catching the fading light. Lyra considered the question carefully, and primitive is not the right word, and she said, "And young maybe. And your species is young, and you have not yet learned the patience that comes with age, and you rush forward without thinking about consequences." Danny laughed, and that sounds about right. And he said, "And we have a tendency to break things and see what happens. That is what worries me." And Lyra admitted, and she did not elaborate, but the thought lingered in her mind, and humans were aggressive and their history filled with wars and conflicts and violence, and what would happen if they gained access to faster than light travel, and to weapons that could destroy planets, and to technology that could reshape reality itself. The ship's reconstruction progressed slowly, and Danny had managed to salvage the quantum drive core, and it was damaged but not beyond repair, and he studied it for days and taking measurements and making calculations and filling notebooks with equations, and Lyra watched him work and impressed, despite herself, and he was bridging millions of years of technological development through pure determination and intelligence. "Show me how this works," and Danny said one morning, and pointing to a component that Lyra recognized as part of the dimensional stabilizer. She hesitated, and this was dangerous knowledge and technology that the Starborn Empire guarded jealously, but she was stranded, and she needed Danny's help, and she needed his tools and his materials and his knowledge of this planet, and she told herself that he could not possibly replicate this technology, and that it was safe to explain. Dimensional stabilizer creates a pocket of folded space, and she began, and allowing the ship to exist partially outside normal reality, and this reduces the effective distance between 2 points and making faster than light travel possible. Danny's eyes lit up with understanding, "And so you are not actually moving faster than light," and he said, "And you are changing the distance itself." "Exactly," and Lyra confirmed and surprised that he had grasped the concept so quickly. Over the following weeks, and Lyra found herself sharing more and more knowledge, and Danny asked about energy generation, and she explained quantum resonance reactors, and he asked about navigation, and she described how they read the cosmic background radiation to plot courses through folded space, and he asked about weapons, and she hesitated longer before describing particle beam technology and antimatter containment. Each explanation felt like a betrayal of her people, but Lyra justified it to herself, and she was simply answering questions and simply helping Danny understand, so he could help her repair the ship. And she was not giving him schematics or blueprints, and just theoretical knowledge. And what harm could that do? Shadow sensed her growing unease, and the massive dragon spent more time close to her, and his intelligent eyes watching her face, and he made low rumbling sounds that she had learned meant concern. And Ember seemed oblivious, and still enchanted by Danny, and by his tools, and by the strange human food he sometimes shared with her. The first sign that something was wrong came when Danny showed her his work, and he had built a small device and crude by Elven standards but functional, and a miniature quantum resonance generator, and it produced a fraction of the power of Elven technology, but it worked, and it should not have worked, and humans did not have the materials or the manufacturing precision or the theoretical understanding to build such things. "How did you do this?" and Lyra asked, and staring at the device in shock. Danny shrugged, and I used what you told me, and he said, and adapted it to what I have available, and it is not efficient. But it proves the concept works. Lyra felt cold despite the desert heat, and she had underestimated him and underestimated humanity. And Danny had taken her explanations and filled in the gaps through experimentation and trial and error, and if one human in a desert workshop could do this in weeks, and what could thousands of human scientists do in years? We should focus on repairing the ship, and Lyra said carefully. And the sooner I can leave and the better. Danny looked hurt. And are you that eager to get away from me? And he asked. It is not that, and Lyra said quickly. And I have responsibilities, and my people will be looking for me, and I cannot stay here forever. But you will come back, and Danny said, and right, and you will visit. Lyra did not answer, and because she did not know. And the Starborn Empire had rules about contact with primitive species and strict rules, and she had already broken so many of them. The ship repair took another month, and working together, and they replaced damaged systems and rebuilt the engine and patched. The hull in Danny's workshop was filled with the smell of ozone and burning metal, and the sound of Ember's excited chirping, and Shadow's concerned rumbles, and finally, and one morning, and Lyra activated the systems, and the ship hummed to life, and lights flickering on and displays showing data and the engine core stable. It works, and Danny said, and his voice filled with awe. And we actually did it. Lyra should have felt relief and should have felt joy and should have been eager to return home, but instead she felt a strange sadness, and she had grown accustomed to Danny's presence and to their conversations, and to the way Ember followed him around and to the simple routine of their days. I should leave soon, and Lyra said, and before someone detects the ship's energy signature. Danny nodded, but he looked as sad as she felt. And will you forget about me? And he asked. And when you get back to your empire, and will I just be some primitive mechanic you once met? Lyra touched his hand in a gesture that would have been scandalous among her people, and no. And she said, and I will not forget. She meant it, but she did not tell him that she would probably be punished for making contact, and that she would be questioned extensively, and that she would have to report everything and every word and every piece of knowledge shared. And she did not tell him that the Starborn Empire would likely send observers to watch his world, and to ensure that humans did not develop dangerous technology too quickly. Danny walked her to the ship, and Ember and Shadow already inside and settling into their familiar places, and he handed her a small device and his phone, and upgraded and modified. And if you ever want to talk, he said, and I added a quantum transmitter, and based on your descriptions, and I think it can send signals across light years. Lyra stared at the device, and this simple human had built a quantum communicator in a few days, and technology that had taken her people centuries to develop, and she should have been terrified, but she was impressed, and you are remarkable. And she said. Danny grinned, and I learned from the best. And he said. Lyra climbed into the ship and sealed the hatch and activated. The engines and the spacecraft lifted smoothly, and sand and dust swirling beneath it. And she looked down at Danny and at the small workshop and at the desert that had been her prison and her refuge, and she felt the pull of duty, and the pull of home, but also a strange reluctance to leave. The ship accelerated in breaking atmosphere and reaching orbit, and Lyra set course for the nearest Starborn outpost, and a journey of several days, and she settled into the pilot's seat, and Ember, curled up nearby, and Shadow watching the view screen as the planet shrank behind them. And Lyra allowed herself to relax. She did not know that Danny's government had already detected unusual energy signatures, and she did not know that military scientists were converging on his workshop, and she did not know that in a few short weeks and everything she had taught him would be seized and analyzed and replicated, and she did not know that she had just changed the course of human history, and that she had given a young and aggressive species the tools to reach the stars, and she would not know until it was far too late. The return to the Starborn Empire should have been triumphant, but instead Lyra felt nothing but dread as her ship approached the crystalline structures of the homeworld, and the planet gleamed like a jewel against the darkness of space, and massive orbital stations circled it, and defense platforms bristled with weapons, and thousands of ships moved in carefully controlled patterns, and Ember sensed her anxiety, and pressed close, and Shadow positioned himself protectively, and his massive form filling the cargo bay. The communication came immediately, and Princess Lyra, and the voice was cold and formal, and you are ordered to dock at Military Station 7 and await escort to the council chamber, and your presence is required for immediate. Debriefing. Lyra's hands trembled on the controls, and they knew. And somehow they already knew about Danny and about the knowledge she had shared and about her violations of the sacred laws. And she docked as ordered, and military personnel met her, and their expressions stern and unyielding, and they did not harm her, and she was royalty after all. But they made it clear she was not free to move about. The council chamber was exactly as she remembered, and ancient and imposing and filled with power. And the elders sat in their floating seats, and their faces carved from stone in disappointment, and the High Chancellor at the center, and his silver eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to flee. And Shadow growled, low in his throat, and Ember trembled against Lyra's leg. Princess Lyra of the Starborn. And the Chancellor began, and his voice echoing through the vast chamber. And you stand accused of violating the most sacred laws of our civilization, and of making extended contact with a primitive species, and of sharing forbidden knowledge, and of endangering the entire empire. And how do you answer these charges? Lyra lifted her chin, and refusing to show weakness. And I was stranded, and she said, and my ship was destroyed, and I needed help to repair it, and the human Danny Rodriguez provided that help, and I would have died without him. The Chancellor's expression did not change, and you could have signaled for rescue, and he said, and you could have waited for our ships to find you, and instead you chose to integrate yourself into primitive society, and to share our technology, and to treat this human as an equal. He was an equal. And Lyra said, and the words coming out before she could stop them, and he is intelligent and kind and capable, and he understood concepts that should have been beyond his species, and he helped me without asking for anything in return. The council chamber erupted in angry murmurs, and elders leaning toward each other and whispering, and their shock evident, and the Chancellor raised his hand for silence, and you taught him about quantum drives, and he said, and about dimensional folding, and about energy manipulation, and about particle weapons. And is this correct? Yes, and Lyra admitted, and because lying would be worse. Another elder spoke, and her voice sharp as broken glass, and observation posts report that this human's government has seized his research, and that human scientists are now attempting to replicate our technology, and that they have made progress, and alarming progress, and in less than 2 cycles they have achieved what took us 5,000 years. Lyra felt the blood drain from her face, and no, and she whispered, and that is not possible. And Danny would not share what we created, and he would not. Danny Rodriguez is currently imprisoned by his own government, and the Chancellor interrupted and forced to work on military applications of the knowledge you provided, and human warships equipped with faster-than-light drives will be operational within a cycle and perhaps sooner, and you have given a violent and aggressive species the ability to spread across the stars. The weight of her mistake crashed down on Lyra, and she had been so careful, and had only shared theoretical knowledge, and had never given Danny complete schematics, but she had underestimated human ingenuity, and their ability to fill in gaps, and their willingness to sacrifice everything for advancement. And Ember whined softly, and Shadow's rumble grew louder and protective and angry. What have I done? And Lyra said, and her voice barely audible, you have potentially doomed us all. And the Chancellor said, and humans are not like other species we have observed, and they do not develop slowly, and they do not proceed with caution, and they seize opportunities and exploit them and turn them into weapons. And your pet human has become a tool of their military, and everything he knows is now in their hands. The other elders began speaking, and their voices overlapping and demanding punishment and demanding action, and some called for Lyra's exile, and others for her execution, and a few suggested sending a military fleet to Earth and to destroy human civilization before they could spread, and Lyra listened to them debate her fate and debate the fate of billions of humans, and she felt sick. Shadow roared, and the sound shaking the chamber and silencing the council, and the massive dragon stepped forward, and placing himself between Lyra and the elders, and his eyes blazing with protective fury, and Ember joined him, and smaller, but no less fierce, and the 2 dragons made their position clear, and they would defend Lyra against anyone, and even against the council itself. We will not execute you, and the Chancellor said after a long moment, and you are of royal blood, and such action would cause political complications, but you cannot remain free, and not after this betrayal. Then what will you do with me? And Lyra asked. You will return to Earth, and the Chancellor said, and you will fix what you have broken, and you will stop the humans before they complete their faster-than-light program, and you will ensure that Danny Rodriguez and his knowledge are eliminated and permanently. Lyra's heart stopped and eliminated, and she repeated, and you want me to kill him? We want you to do whatever is necessary, and the elder with the sharp voice said, and erase their databases and destroy their prototypes, and yes, and eliminate the human if you must, and set their civilization back to where it was before you interfered. I will not kill Danny, and Lyra said, and her voice firm despite her fear. Then you will find another way, and the Chancellor said, but failure is not acceptable, and if humans achieve faster than light capability, and if they begin expanding into the galaxy, and the Starborn Empire will have no choice but to respond with overwhelming force, and we will sterilize their world, and we will eliminate the threat completely. And is that what you want? No? And Lyra whispered. Then you understand your mission, and the Chancellor continued, and you have one cycle, and maybe two at most, and stop them and save your human friend. If you can, but stop them, and guards will escort you to your ship, and you will depart immediately. The council session ended, and Lyra was led back to her ship, and her mind racing, and she had one cycle to somehow undo months of damage and to stop an entire planet from achieving faster-than-light travel and to save Danny from his own government and from her people. And the task was impossible, but she had no choice. The flight back to Earth was the longest of her life, and she used Danny's modified communicator and the quantum device he had built, and she sent a signal, and hoping it would reach him, and hoping he could respond, and for days there was nothing, and just silence. And then finally, a crackling message came through Lyra, and Danny's voice was strained and tired. And is that really you? And I did not think I would hear from you again. Danny, and Lyra said, and her relief overwhelming. And what happened? And the council said, your government took your research. They came a week after you left, and Danny said, and military and scientists, and they surrounded my workshop and took everything, and they have been forcing me to work on weapons and on faster-than-light engines, and I tried to refuse, but they threatened, and they said they would hurt people I care about. I am so sorry. And Lyra said, and this is my fault, and I should never have told you anything, and I should have known better. No. And Danny said firmly, and you saved my life, and you treated me like an equal, and you trusted me, and this is not your fault, and my government did this and not you. The council wants me to stop the program. And Lyra said, and they want me to destroy your research and to erase the databases, and they want me to eliminate you. Danny was quiet for a long moment, and eliminate, and he finally said, and you mean kill? Yes. And Lyra whispered, will you do it? And Danny asked, and there was no fear in his voice and just curiosity. Never. And Lyra said, and I will find another way, and I will get you out of there, and I will stop this without hurting you. The facility is heavily guarded, and Danny said, and military personnel and weapons and security systems, and you cannot just walk in, and even with your dragons, it would be suicide. Then I will be creative, and Lyra said, and just hold on, and I am coming. She ended the transmission and looked at Ember and Shadow, and the two dragons watched her with intelligent eyes, and they knew something was wrong, and they knew a fight was coming, and they were ready. And Lyra began planning and thinking through options and discarding ideas and searching for a solution that would not end in death and in war and in the destruction of everything she cared about. The ship approached. Earth, and Lyra could see the blue and green world ahead, and beautiful and fragile and home to billions of humans who had no idea their fate was being decided. And she thought about Danny trapped in some military facility, and about the council's ultimatum, and about the impossible task ahead, and she made her decision. The military facility was nothing like Danny's simple workshop, and it sprawled across several square miles of desert and surrounded by triple layers of fencing and guard towers and armed soldiers and heat sensors and motion detectors and automated defense systems. And Lyra observed it from a distance, and her ship cloaked and hidden in the hills, and Ember and Shadow restless beside her, and sensing her tension and her fear. She had spent 3 days studying the facility and watching the patterns, and the shift changes in the supply deliveries and the security protocols, and Danny was inside somewhere and trapped and forced to work on technology that would bring disaster to both their civilizations, and she had to get him out and had to destroy the research and had to do it without starting a war. The hardest part was knowing that her own people were watching, and starborn observation posts tracked every move and recorded every decision. And if she failed, and if humans achieved faster than light travel and the Council would send warships and Earth would burn and billions would die, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on her until she could barely breathe. Danny's modified communicator buzzed and a signal, coming through and weak and encrypted, and Lyra answered immediately. "They are moving me tomorrow," and Danny said, and his voice barely above a whisper, "and transferring me to another facility. And this is your best chance. And tonight, and during the shift change at midnight, and security will be at its lowest." "How do you know this?" and Lyra asked. "I have been paying attention," and Danny said, "and learning their patterns, and I may be a prisoner, but I am not helpless in the east entrance and Section 7. And that is where they are keeping me, and the security there is lighter because they think it is less important." Lyra felt a surge of affection for this clever human, and always thinking and always planning, and even in captivity, and "Okay," and she said, "and be ready." The plan was dangerous and possibly suicidal, but it was the only chance they had. And Lyra waited until nightfall, and until the desert was dark and the stars blazing overhead, and she approached the facility on foot, and leaving her ship hidden, and Ember flew high above and her golden scales invisible against the night sky. And Shadow moved beside Lyra, and his midnight blue form blending with the darkness. The fence was the first obstacle, and electrified, and monitored and alarmed, but Lyra had technology the humans had never seen. And she placed a small device against the metal, and it created a localized field disruption and a gap in the electrical current, and she cut through the fence with a plasma torch, and the metal melting like butter, and Shadow slipped through, and Lyra followed, and her heart pounding. Guards patrolled in predictable patterns, and Lyra used her elven magic to bend light around herself and Shadow, and becoming effectively invisible. And they moved through the compound like ghosts, and past soldiers who never saw them, and past cameras that recorded nothing, and past sensors that detected only empty air section. 7 was in the eastern part of the facility, and a cluster of low buildings that looked less important than the central research labs, and Lyra found the building Danny had described, and she could sense his presence inside, and familiar, and warm, and alive. And she placed her hand against the door, and the lock was electronic and sophisticated by human standards, but simple compared to elven technology, and she bypassed it in seconds. The interior was dimly lit, and corridors lined with doors, and each one locked, and each one hiding secrets, and Lyra moved quickly, and checking room after room until she found him, and Danny was sitting on a narrow bed and looking exhausted and thin and pale, but his eyes lit up when he saw her materialize from the shadows. "You came," and he said, and standing and moving toward her. "Of course I came," and Lyra said, "and we need to move quickly, and can you walk?" Danny nodded, "And they have been working me hard, but I am okay." Shadow pushed the door open wider, and his massive form filling the doorway, and Danny smiled at the dragon, and "Good to see you too, and big guy." And he said alarms began blaring before they reached the exit, and red lights spinning and sirens wailing, and someone had discovered the breach, and soldiers were converging on their location. And Lyra grabbed Danny's hand and run. And she said, and Shadow charged ahead and clearing the path, and his tail smashing through doors and his roar shaking the walls. They burst outside, and guards were shouting and weapons firing and bullets ricocheting off Shadow's armored scales, and Lyra threw up an energy shield and deflecting the projectiles and protecting Danny, and they ran toward the fence and toward freedom, and then the explosion hit. The blast threw Lyra forward, and her shield shattering, and her ears ringing, and she rolled and came up ready to fight. And a missile had struck nearby, and military helicopters circled overhead, and their searchlights cutting through the darkness, and more soldiers were arriving, and dozens and hundreds, and they were surrounded. Shadow roared a challenge, and flames building in his throat, and Ember dove from the sky, and her golden form blazing with fury, and the two dragons positioned themselves protectively and ready to fight an entire army if necessary, and Lyra knew they could not win, and not against this many, and not without killing, and that would doom them all. Stand down, and a voice boomed through speakers, and you are surrounded and there is no escape. Danny pressed close to Lyra, and his hand finding hers, and I am sorry. And he said, and I tried to warn you about the security. This is not your fault. And Lyra said, and looking at the soldiers, and at the weapons, and at the helicopters, and her mind racing and searching for options. She could fight, and Shadow and Ember were powerful, and elven magic could devastate human forces, but that would mean death and would mean war and would mean everything she was trying to prevent, and she could surrender, but they would imprison her and take her ship and study her technology and make everything worse, and she could try to talk, but humans did not seem inclined to negotiate. The decision was made when she saw the weapon they were bringing out, and massive and mounted on a vehicle and pointed at Shadow. And Lyra recognized it immediately. And a particle cannon, and built from her designs and from the knowledge she had shared with Danny and humans, had weaponized elven technology faster than she thought possible, and if they fired that at her dragons. Wait, and Lyra shouted, and holding up her hands, and I will surrender, and just do not hurt my dragons. The voice from the speaker was silent for a moment, and then release the human, and step away from the creatures, and do it slowly. Lyra looked at Danny, and his face pale in the searchlights, and I cannot leave you here, and she said, you have to. And Danny said, and take your dragons and go and save yourself. I came here to save you, and Lyra insisted. And you did, and Danny said, and you showed me that I matter and that someone cares, and that is enough, and now go before they kill you. Shadow growled and refusing to leave, and Ember circled overhead and crying out in distress, and Lyra felt tears burning her eyes. And this was not how it was supposed to end, and she had failed. And failed Danny, and failed her people, and failed everyone. Then the world exploded into chaos, and another ship appeared overhead, and massive and bristling with weapons, and not human design, and not anything Lyra recognized, and it fired on the military forces and precision strikes that disabled vehicles and scattered soldiers, but did not kill. And the voice that came through her communicator was unexpected. Princess Lyra, and it said, and this is Captain Torres of the Starborn military, and we have been ordered to extract you and prepare for immediate departure. But the council and Lyra said, and confused, and they wanted me to stop. The humans' plans have changed, and Torres said, and the humans have launched their first faster-than-light probe, and it successfully reached another star system, and the council has decided that humanity cannot be stopped and only managed. And we are taking you both to neutral space for negotiations. The military ship descended, and a boarding ramp extending, and soldiers in elven armor emerged and moving with practiced efficiency and securing the area, and the human forces pulled back and outmatched and outgunned and clearly ordered to stand down, and Danny stared in shock. What is happening? And he asked, I think we are being rescued, and Lyra said, and equally confused. The elven soldiers escorted them onto the ship, and Shadow and Ember following, and as they lifted off, and Lyra looked down at the facility and at the desert and at Earth shrinking below, and she realized everything had changed, and humans had achieved faster-than-light travel, and the galaxy would never be the same. And her relationship with Danny had somehow become the center of interstellar politics. Captain Torres met them on the bridge, and a tall, stern woman with silver hair, and the council has decided that extinction of humanity would create more problems than it solves, and she said, and instead we will attempt diplomacy and trade and controlled cultural exchange, and you and the human Danny Rodriguez will serve as ambassadors. Lyra stared at her, and ambassadors. And we are prisoners. You will be if you refuse. And Torres said bluntly, but if you cooperate and if you help us establish peaceful relations with humanity, and you will be free to go wherever you wish, and even to stay together. If that is what you want. Danny squeezed Lyra's hand. And what do you think? And he asked, think we do not have much choice, and Lyra said, but maybe this is better than war and better than extinction. The neutral space station hung between stars, and a massive structure built by a species long extinct and maintained by automated systems that had run for millennia, and it was the perfect location for the historic negotiations between the Starborn Empire and humanity, and neither side had advantage here, and neither side could claim territory. And Lyra stood at the observation window and watching ships arrive from both civilizations, and her reflection ghostly in the glass. Danny joined her, and carrying 2 cups of something hot and human coffee. and he had insisted the station's food synthesizers learn to make it, and he handed one to Lyra, and she sipped it carefully, and still finding the bitter taste strange, and but comforting, because it reminded her of their time in the desert workshop 3 months, and Danny said, in 3 months of talking and arguing and compromising. And do you think we are any closer to peace? Lyra considered the question, and yes. And she said, and but also, no, and both sides are afraid, and fear makes people do stupid things. Shadow and Ember had the run of the station, and the massive blue dragon often explored the ancient corridors, and Ember had made friends with some of the human delegates, and she performed tricks for them and breathed small flames and accepted treats, and Lyra worried that her dragons were becoming too comfortable with humans, but maybe that was the point, and maybe that was how peace worked, and small connections and small friendships and building trust, one interaction at a time. The negotiations were brutal, and the Starborn Empire wanted restrictions on human expansion, and wanted oversight of human technology, and wanted guarantees that humans would not weaponize everything they touched, and humanity wanted respect, and wanted to be treated as equals, and wanted access to the galaxy without restrictions, and both sides had valid concerns, and both sides refused to back down. Lyra and Danny served as mediators, and cultural translators, and living proof that cooperation was possible. And they explained elven customs to human diplomats and human behavior to Starborn elders, and they shared meals with both sides, and listened to complaints, and offered suggestions, and slowly and painfully progress was made. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, and a young human scientist named Lisa Chen, and she had been studying elven medical technology, and she discovered that humans and elves could share certain treatments, and that human research into genetic diseases could help elves, and in that elven regenerative medicine could save human lives, and suddenly both sides had something to offer each other, and something beyond just avoiding war. We could establish joint research stations, and Lisa proposed during a session, and combined human innovation with elven knowledge and medical advances would benefit both civilizations. The Starborn representatives were skeptical, and humans are too reckless, and one elder said, and they would turn medical research into weapons. We have weapons, and a human general replied, and we have nuclear arsenals and biological agents, and we have not used them, and not for decades, and we understand restraint. Do you and another Starborn elder challenged, and you have been in space for less than a year, and already you have militarized faster than light travel, and already you have built warships, and already you provoke border incidents because you treat us like children, and the general shot back, and you want to control us and to limit us and to keep us trapped in our own system, and we will not accept that. The argument escalated, and voices rising and old grievances surfacing, and Lyra felt the familiar despair settling over her, and they were so close to agreement, and it was falling apart. Danny stood suddenly, and enough, and he said, and his voice cutting through the noise, and everyone fell silent and surprised, and the human mechanic rarely spoke during these sessions, and everyone listened to me. And I am just a guy who fixed cars in the desert, and I am not a diplomat or a politician or a genius. But I know one thing, and fear is destroying this. He looked around the room, and at elves and humans, and at the tension, and you are all afraid, and he continued, and elves are afraid humans will be too aggressive and will spread too fast and will turn the galaxy into a war zone, and humans are afraid elves will control us and will limit us and will treat us like we are inferior, and both fears are valid and both are also stupid. Lyra wanted to stop him and worried he was making things worse, but the room was listening and really listening, and Danny pressed on. Princess Lyra crashed in my desert, and he said, and I could have called the government and could have turned her over and could have sold her technology for millions, but I did not. And I helped her because it was the right thing to do, and she could have left me behind when things got dangerous and could have let the military keep me and could have saved herself, but she came back, and she risked everything. He pointed to Shadow and Ember, and resting in the corner of the conference chamber, and those dragons could destroy this entire station if they wanted. And he said, and they have the power, but they choose not to use it. And because Lyra taught them restraint and taught them that power is not about destruction, and humans can learn that too, but only if you give us the chance. A Starborn elder leaned forward, and what guarantee do we have that humans will show restraint? And she asked, what guarantee do we have that elves will not try to control us? And Danny replied, and there are no guarantees and there is only trust, and trust has to start somewhere. The room was silent, and the weight of his words settling over everyone, and Lyra felt pride swelling in her chest. And this simple human mechanic had said what needed to be said, and had cut through all the political posturing, and had spoken a fundamental truth. Lisa Chen spoke again, and what if we start small? And she said, and establish one joint research station, and focused on medical technology, and no weapons and no military applications and just healing, and both sides contribute equally, and both sides benefit equally, and we prove we can work together. The proposal was debated for hours, but eventually and reluctantly and both sides agreed. And one station and one project and one chance to prove that cooperation was possible, and it was not the grand peace treaty everyone had hoped for, but it was a beginning. The weeks that followed were busy, and Lyra and Danny helped select the location for the research station and helped choose the teams and helped establish protocols, and humans and elves working together, and cautiously and respectfully and learning from each other. Captain Torres approached Lyra one evening, and the stern woman who had rescued them looking almost friendly. And the council has made a decision about your status. And she said, Lyra braced herself, and you are no longer considered a criminal. And Torres said, and your actions have been instrumental in preventing war, and you are free to go and to live where you wish and with whom you wish. Lyra looked at Danny, and who was across the room and talking with Lisa, and gesturing animatedly, and explaining something about quantum mechanics and what about Danny, and she asked, and what will happen to him? He has been offered a position as chief human liaison for the joint research program. And Torres said, and quite prestigious and quite well paid, and he has accepted. Relief flooded through Lyra, and so we can stay together, and she said, if that is what you both want. And Torres confirmed, and the council understands that your relationship with the human is complicated, but they also recognize that it represents the future, and cooperation, and understanding and shared purpose. Shadow approached, and his massive head nudging Lyra's hand, and Ember chirped from Danny's shoulder, and where she had perched while he talked, and the two dragons had adapted well to their new life, and had become symbols of the fragile peace, and Lyra smiled. The first joint research station was completed 6 months later, and a beautiful structure combining elven aesthetics with human functionality, and gleaming white walls and crystalline domes, and advanced laboratories and living quarters and gardens where both species could relax, and the station orbited a neutral world, and accessible to both civilizations. The opening ceremony was attended by representatives from both sides, and speeches were made, and treaties were signed, and hope was kindled, and Lyra stood beside Danny and watching the celebration, and Shadow and Ember by their side. And she thought about the journey that had brought them here. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not helped me? And Lyra asked Danny all the time, and Danny admitted, and maybe there would have been war, and maybe humans would have been destroyed, and maybe we would have destroyed each other, but we will never know, because I made a different choice, and I made a choice to trust you. And Lyra said, choices matter, and Danny said, and sliding his hand into hers, and we chose each other, and we chose peace, and we chose to believe that two civilizations could find common ground. A research station began its work, and humans and elves collaborating on medical breakthroughs and sharing knowledge and learning from each other. And Lisa Chen made the first major discovery and a treatment for a genetic disease that affected both species, and proof that cooperation could produce miracles. More joint projects were proposed, and astronomy and physics and environmental science and cultural exchange programs, and slowly, and year by year, and the two civilizations grew closer, and conflicts still arose and misunderstandings still happened, but the foundation had been laid, and Lyra and Danny had shown that friendship could bridge the gap between stars.